called America's New Nihilism. Systemic racism is a systemic forgetting of 55 years of urban policy failure. Please stick to the end. This is very, very important. People talk about how there's such a haves and have-nots and why the ghettos are the way they are. You're about to hear this very, very well-written short piece. It says here, "This is not 1968, it's worse. The late 1960s were the heyday of modern American liberalism, which was then an ideology of hope. A bipartisan Congress passed landmark civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1965. The precipitating event of the urban riots in 1968 was the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. New York, Trenton, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, Kansas City, and Washington were on fire. Arguably back then, despite passage of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, not enough time had passed for liberal policies to ameliorate conditions in the inner cities. Last week, George Floyd died after rough treatment from arresting Minneapolis police officer Derks, who was arrested and charged with murder. Since then, there have been daily protests accompanied by riot and pillage in multiple U.S. cities. A primary claim made repeatedly this week is that the U.S., which means the American people, are guilty of a perpetual systemic racism. It's evident from the coverage that most of the demonstrators were born after 1990. By then, the Great Society programs had been in place for 25 years, and now it is 55 years. Annual budget appropriations totaling multiple trillions of dollars on Medicaid, food stamps, welfare, public housing, rent subsidies, and federal aid to public schools have produced what? Since the 1960s, essentially little has changed in the neighborhood at the center of those long-ago urban riots. By current telling, they are about as poor and crime-ridden and undereducated and in poor health as they were when LBJ said he would change them. That means 5 decades of stasis and stagnation in America's most marginalized places, virtually all of it under Democratic, now progressive, political control. The failure of the liberal model is by now so embarrassing that the current owners of that model have created an alternative universe of explanations, such as blaming it on American settlers in the early 17th century or the non-existence of justice. I gotta pause there. This is what I've been trying to describe at the risk of being called racist nonstop because it's already happened a million times. This is what I'm trying to describe here. There has been this haves and have-nots and ghettos and all of this poor American education and upbringing, and so much of it is due to all these overbearing laws that have been passed. The 1994 Crime Bill, the 1998 War on Drugs, the Anti-Abuse Act, these Great Society programs that were put in place in the 60s, like it says there, welfare and housing assistance and Medicaid, about all these programs, and none of them are working as it said. So let me continue. It must be working because marchers in Paris and Berlin, of all places, are lecturing the U.S. on systemic racism. Thanks for the memories. This is worse than 1968 because the political system is now engaged in a systemic act of forgetting. Let's forget that this policy failure has happened or why. Let's forget, for instance, that the people living in New York's public housing are overrun with rats, unlit hallways, and no heat in the winter. These are the government housings. Let's forget that many blacks have indeed been left behind by a well-documented migration since 1990 of black Americans out of northern cities and Los Angeles into the South, where they have gone in search of economic opportunity. Let's forget, despite a massive per annum outlay on Medicaid, some $600 billion in 2018, that black Americans still have higher incidence of chronic disease. Simply performing a cut and paste on 50 years of political history is an act of nihilism, pummeled by activists in the media with constant accusations of systemic racism as of this week. And despite what many thought were 50 years of good faith efforts on racial conciliation, people go numb, concluding that the solution being offered is now literally no solution. In fact, let me add on to that. Reader's note here. I'm watching all of these people across the country on cable news and on radio and podcasts and on Twitter and wherever suggesting what should be done to resolve this issue. I've heard so many different ways of how we should deal with the police. I've heard of so many different justice things that we can do. I have not heard anyone talk about repealing or actively going back to investigate the laws and the legislation that got to this place. And not a single progressive or a single modern-day Democrat that I have talked to has actually talked about this. In fact, it's just like it says. It's such a simple answer to say, oh, it's your privilege. Oh, it's systemic. Oh, it's institutional. Well, what are the institutions that put that in place? What systems were put in place that caused all this? It's very frustrating. Continuing, this new progressive nihilism says the answer to inner city crime is decriminalization. Because of New York's new bail reform law, most of the looters arrested are being released, even as murderers and burglaries were increasing in the city's poorest neighborhoods before these events. If you don't know what's going on, again, reader's note here. In big cities like Chicago and New York, they have this new thing where you can just sign your name right there when you get arrested and you have posted bail. Now you have to pay it later, but you get out immediately. So what are criminals going to do? They get arrested, they go in, they check in, they get the information, they sign e-bail 20 minutes, 30 minutes later, and they leave the jail and they're right back wherever they were before. This is very popular in big cities right now. So continuing. The new nihilism minimizes this week's ideological driven assaults on private property because it is replaceable. In fact, it is well established that many of the 1968's burned down neighborhoods have struggled to revive ever since. The new nihilism says no matter how many reform police commissioners are appointed or black mayors elected, nothing has changed. And that is the definition of hopelessness. Tell me that east of Troost does not have hopelessness right now. Continuing. It is not hopeless. One could, for example, give a better chance at home ownership and equity, as HUD Secretary Ben Carson has proposed, through reforms of the mortgage lending market and reducing regulatory hurdles to urban housing construction. Get rid of those god-awful public housing prisons. But no, the public housing authorities are patron mills, so it can't happen. Black parents love charter schools and voucher-supported private schools because they teach values, self-respect, and hope. But no, this option for poor and lower-income parents has more Democrat Party opposition than ever. When will we see white college students marching in the streets over this moral abomination? Never. One could argue that the job creation and rising income of recent years for young black Americans are more in step with the U.S.'s 244 year of history of opportunity, but why bother? The nihilism of permanent guilt is easier because it substitutes sentiment for substance and absolves anyone of responsibility for past public policy errors. There's that word again, responsibility. It remains to be learned how the American people of any race are processing the events of the past week. Media minimalism says the choices between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. It's a lot bigger than that. It is much bigger than that. And you guys, that's why when my Democrat friends, you know who you are when you're watching right now, this is why I say this is not Democrat versus Republican. This is people who actually love the country and want to figure out how to unite and fix it. And my idea is going through and repealing these things like we're just described here that have completely screwed over so many Americans. Or we don't admit the wrongs and we continue just putting more bandages and more bandages. Like it says, doing the e-bail thing. It's a solution for a problem that was already created by them.
My name is Ryan Derks. I'm running from Missouri's 5th Congressional District, and I approve this message.